Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something really interesting? We're going to be talking about global power shifts today, especially with, well, the US and China. And you won't believe what's happening with India. But first, a little bit of a reality check. Did you know that there are over 30 armed conflicts happening around the world right now?
Wow.
Yeah, it's easy to miss with all the focus on the big headlines, Ukraine and
Yeah.
Gaza and all that, but it really shows you just how much is going on under the surface.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think
Yeah.
we tend to get fixated on, like you said, the major conflicts like
hmm
Ukraine, Gaza, but these smaller conflicts really do have a ripple effect that can be felt globally.
Yeah, for sure. So for this deep dive, we're using a fantastic interview with Palki Sharma. She's the managing editor at First Post, and she has this incredible way of explaining uh, complex geopolitics. So it actually makes sense.
I agree, she's great. And she uses some really good examples to illustrate her points, like the situation in Sudan, for example. It's a crisis that's displaced 11 million people,
Hmm.
a humanitarian disaster. But it barely gets a mention in the news.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. It makes you wonder, have we become almost numb to these conflicts?
Yeah, perhaps. But what's even more interesting, I think, is that we're not just talking about traditional warfare anymore. Economic conflicts has become a weapon in itself. Trade wars, tariffs, strategic maneuvering for leverage, it's all part of this new power game. Kind of like, like a high-stakes game of risk, but with real-world consequences.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And Palki actually brings up the US-China trade war and how
Yeah.
China is putting pressure on European imports. It's a reminder that every move has consequences on that global chessboard.
Absolutely. And speaking of moves, over 50 countries held elections in 2024, with many incumbent governments losing.
Yeah.
So that means new players, new agendas, and a potential reshuffling of global alliances. Think about the UK's Rwanda plan for asylum seekers, for example.
Yeah.
It's a clear example of how policy shifts with changing governments and how those shifts then impact global
Yeah,
relationships.
it's a real domino effect. And it all ties back to Palki's point that the global picture is constantly changing, which it creates both instability and opportunity, right?
Right.
Especially for nations that are looking to step onto the world stage in a bigger way. It's a good reminder that we need to be adaptable and stay informed,
Right.
in this changing world.
Exactly. So let's talk about some of the major players in this global power shift. Can the U.S. maintain its dominance, or is its power waning?
Hmm.
Kalki seems to think that a decline is happening, though it might be gradual.
Yeah, and she's not just saying that without evidence, right? She points to some pretty compelling factors: rising national debt, internal conflicts, and polarization. And of course, the rising influence of China, India, and other nations. It makes you wonder if America's internal struggles might actually weaken its global standing.
That's a good question. And it's fascinating that even with these challenges, Pelkey still believes that the U.S. offers individuals a fair shot at success because of its democratic foundation. It makes you think about how important that opportunity really is.
It really does. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about China. We've got some interesting contrasting opinions here. Ray Dalio, the investor, is bullish on both India and China. But Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner, thinks India will never reach China's level of growth because of, well, language and social barriers.
Yeah, I've heard that too. And here's where Palkey's perspective gets really thought-provoking. She argues that diversity is actually a strength for India, comparing it to uh, a family where disagreements don't break the house. Could this unity and diversity actually be India's secret weapon in the global power race?
That's a great point, especially considering how much emphasis is placed on diversity and inclusion in the corporate world these days. Maybe Munger is overlooking a key strength that could propel India forward.
It's certainly possible. But Palki also has some serious concerns about China's leadership, particularly Xi Jinping's aggressive expansionism. She describes his approach as antagonizing everybody. And she's not just talking in theory either.
Right. She gives some pretty chilling examples: the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, the tensions with Taiwan, Japan, and Australia. And then there's what's called debt trap diplomacy in developing countries. This is where China offers loans to countries, knowing they can't repay, and then leverages that debt for political influence. It's a pattern of behavior that's raising serious red flags globally.
It really is. And then there's the issue of human rights in China, specifically those disappearing figures.
Yeah.
Defense ministers vanishing after meetings, Jack Ma going silent after criticizing the government, an actress and a tennis player reappearing as shadows of their former selves after speaking out.
It's hard to hear those stories and not feel a sense of unease. It raises the question, is China's economic progress coming at the cost of individual freedom?
Huh.
And is that a sustainable model in the long run?
It's definitely a question worth pondering, especially when you contrast it with India's growing global influence, which seems to be having its moment in the spotlight. Ray Dalio predicts that India will see the most significant economic growth and power shifts in the next 20 years. That's a bold statement.
Yeah, it is. But are there obstacles that could stand in their way?
Oh, there certainly are. We've talked about the concerns raised by that Japanese investor
Yeah,
about
yeah.
India's skilled labor shortage and challenges with corruption and ease of doing business. And then there's that whole demographic time bomb issue. Can India truly provide opportunities for its young and growing population, especially with AI automation potentially disrupting labor markets globally? It's a big question mark hanging over their future.
Yeah, for sure. But Palki offers a different perspective, a more personal, anecdotal one. She talks about witnessing upward mobility across different socioeconomic levels in India.
Interesting.
She gives the example of a milk delivery man who worked hard and eventually built a successful buffalo farm. You know, I'm struck by Palki's optimism about India. It's inspiring, even contagious. But given these challenges, is she being overly idealistic?
Maybe. But maybe that's what it takes to drive change. She said these stories ignite her. And I think that speaks to the power of hope and possibility, even in the face of adversity. It's a reminder that even amidst global power struggles, individual stories of resilience and progress still matter. Yeah, they really do. And those individual stories, they often get lost, in a larger narrative of global power shifts. But Palki brings up a really crucial point, I think, about the nature of international relations. She emphasizes that every country ultimately looks out for itself. So what does it mean to rely on another country in today's complex world? And what are the implications of choosing neutrality versus alliances?
Yeah, those are big questions. And it can feel overwhelming even to think about them, honestly, especially when you consider how much is happening on a global scale. But I think hearing Palki's perspective on India's approach might help.
Yeah, it's definitely insightful. She describes India's approach as strategic autonomy, basically meaning that India prioritizes what's best for its own interests, regardless of any external pressures. It's a stance that allows for a lot of flexibility and adaptability in a world where alliances are constantly shifting, right?
So it's about forging their own path
Yeah.
and not being beholden to any one country or bloc. I guess that makes sense, especially for a country with India's unique history and position in the world.
Exactly. And we're actually seeing a shift in India's diplomatic style as well.
Yeah.
There's a move away from quiet diplomacy towards more assertive responses, particularly under Minister Jai Thakur. Palki sees this as a source of national pride for India.
It does seem like India is becoming more vocal on the global stage. It's not just about reacting to events anymore. It's about actively shaping the conversation and taking a leadership role. It's like they're saying, we're here, we have a voice, and we're going to use it.
Right, exactly. And their voice is being heard.
Yeah.
Palki shared an anecdote about the Jamaican prime minister, revealing she's a fan of her show. It might seem like a small detail, but it illustrates the global reach of India's influence.
Yeah, it's a great example of how soft power, culture, media, ideas can really shape global perceptions. It's not just about military might or economic dominance anymore. It's about projecting your values and your worldview onto the world stage. And in a world where information spreads so quickly, that kind of influence can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. But let's not forget about those hard power realities we discussed earlier, right? The conflicts, the economic maneuvering, the diplomatic shifts. It all ties back to the question, what does this mean for the average person?
Yeah, that's the part that feels the most daunting, I think. How do we even begin to understand how these global shifts will impact our lives?
It's true. The world is increasingly complex and interconnected. What happens in one part of the world can have a direct impact on you, even if you're thousands of miles away. But that doesn't mean we should just bury our heads in the sand.
So what can we do? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this information and just tune it all out.
The key is to stay informed and be aware of the forces that are shaping the world around us. And it's about being discerning. Don't just accept headlines at face value. Dig deeper, consider different perspectives, and form your own conclusions.
It's about connecting the dots, right? Seeing how events, trends, and decisions are all intertwined and understanding the bigger picture.
Precisely. And realizing that this is an ongoing process. The world is in constant flux. We need to be adaptable and resilient in the face of change.
So what does all of this mean for the future? Can we predict anything with certainty?
Well, predictions are always tricky, especially in geopolitics. But Pelkey did offer one specific prediction that I think is worth considering. She believes that India could become the world's third largest economy by 2030.
Wow, that would be a major shift in the global economic landscape. Do you think India is really on track to achieve that kind of dominance?
It's certainly within the realm of possibility. India has a lot working in its favor. A young and growing population, a booming tech sector, and a government that seems committed to economic growth.
But what about those challenges we talked about earlier, right? The corruption, the ease of doing business, the skilled labor shortages. Won't those factors hold them back?
They certainly could. And then there's the looming threat of AI automation, which could disrupt labor markets globally. That's the wild card. No one knows for sure how AI will impact the global economy, but it's something we all need to be thinking about.
AI really does add another layer of complexity to everything. It's like we're standing at a crossroads, facing multiple paths ahead. But which path will lead to a better future? And who will be the ones making those decisions?
That's the challenge, isn't it? To navigate these complexities and try to create a better future for ourselves and for future generations. We need to think critically, be informed, and engage in these conversations, because the decisions we make today will have a ripple effect far into the future.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to consider, but I think this deep dive has given us, well, a good framework for understanding these global power shifts.
Right.
We've explored the rise of new players, the potential decline of established powers, the role of economic conflict, and the impact of these changing political landscapes. It's clear that we're living in a world that's in constant flux, where alliances are shifting and the balance of power is being renegotiated.
It is.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed, the decisions made by, well, by governments and individuals alike are going to have far-reaching consequences. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future,
Yeah.
whether it's through staying informed,
Yeah.
engaging in these conversations, or simply being aware of the forces at play in the world around us.
Yeah. That's a really empowering thought, actually.
Yeah.
It's not about feeling helpless, right, in the face of all these global shifts. It's about recognizing our own agency and using it to create positive change. But before we wrap up, I wanted to go back to Pelkey's point about India. She was incredibly optimistic about its future, even acknowledging a bit of personal bias there. But she also acknowledged the immense challenges the country faces. So the question is, can India really overcome these obstacles and rise to the top? Or will those challenges ultimately hold it back from achieving its full potential?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I don't think there's an easy answer. India certainly has the potential to become a global superpower. It has a young and dynamic population, a rapidly growing economy, and a strategic location in a region that's becoming increasingly important.
Right. But as we discussed, there are also significant challenges. Poverty, inequality, corruption, and a lack of infrastructure. And then there's the question of whether India can truly embrace its diversity.
Yeah.
And use it as a source of strength rather than division.
Those are all valid concerns. And only time will tell how India navigates these challenges. But one thing is for sure, India's journey will be one of the most fascinating stories to watch unfold in the coming decades. This story of ambition, resilience, and the pursuit of a place on the world stage.
Yeah. And that sense of ambition and resilience, it really resonated with me throughout this entire deep dive. It's a reminder that even in a world that feels increasingly complex and uncertain, there's still room for hope and progress.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that we all have a part to play in shaping the future, whether it's on a global scale or in our own communities.
Well said. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into global power shifts. It's been an enlightening conversation, and I hope it's left you with some new insights and perspectives.
It's been a pleasure. And to our listeners, remember to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. The world is changing rapidly, and it's up to all of us to shape the future we want to see.